My guest today is Albert Cow from the Santa Fe Institute. Albert has a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, and his research, as we discuss in this podcast, ranges from studying the collective behavior of ants and schools of fishes to is fishes the right plural? Fish? Schools of fish? Whatever. I know there's controversy surrounding octopus and octopi these days, so who knows what to expect in 2020. Anyway, collective behavior in animals, and then branching out from that into wisdom of crowds and collective decision making and information loss passing amongst networks. And along with a group of other scholars, Albert is potentially dipping his toe into trying to figure out some policy recommendations to help us deal with the sludge of misinformation spewing forth from our social networks these days, which I think is a very admirable and important task to undertake. So without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Albert Cow. So, Albert, if we're thinking about a bunch of different people all coming up with an idea of what should happen, or a bunch of different animals trying to kind of like solve some problems about how like fish should school, or birds should migrate somewhere. We have these concepts of wisdom of crowds and like collective behavior and all this kind of stuff. And I think depending on how the question is framed, sometimes people have an intuition that like more people thinking about something or more like animals working together is positive. In other cases, people have an intuition that that's not necessarily good, that you can get these kind of like wild negative outcomes that happen if there's too many cooks in the kitchen, right? You can sort of come up with a colloquialism for either side of pretty much every issue. And you've done a lot of research on this stuff to really figure out like, okay, in what scenarios is it good to have more information or more people or more like individuals kind of involved in a process? And when is it not so good? So I think that, to start with, it might be really useful to break down just some basic concepts of like, how are we thinking about like different networks? How are we thinking about information being shared between them? How are we thinking about decision making? Very open-ended, just give us a primer on what we're even talking about here.
Yeah, I think you're right that there are like very famous cases in which groups can make really spectacular decisions or innovations together. It's sort of like the history of society, like the development of society and in our technologies has come about because we've been social. And at the same time, there's a lot of cases where being social is disastrous, like runs on banks or crashes in the stock market. Things of that sort, these like mob mentality sorts of situations. And so, yeah, there's a big question out there of like how and when do you get the wisdom of crowds, and how and when do you get the madness of crowds? And can we tilt our decision making in whatever context, in the towards a positive outcome? So my work, mostly I think about animal groups of the sort that you mentioned. So ant colonies, fish schools, bird flocks, even some non-animals like slime molds, and a little bit humans as well. And thinking about what kinds of decisions do they face in daily life? What kind of decision-making mechanisms do they have available to them? And then how do they make decisions in the kinds of environments that they find themselves situated in? And in a lot of cases, one would assume that these animals are fairly simple, like cognitively. Like there's no person who can like stand up and talk to, say, a whole flock of 1,000 birds or something. Typically, these interactions are very local. And so a bird is maybe looking at the 5 or 6 birds surrounding it and seeing like, oh, they're moving in this direction. Maybe I should move in that direction, or maybe I shouldn't, or something. So it's like very local, simple interactions we think is going on. And somehow, in a lot of cases in nature, these simple interactions combine and you get some emergence of some really interesting collective behaviors. And so theoretically, I try to model these systems. And I said these local interactions can be quite simple, but organisms in nature, including humans, are super complicated, right? They have these flight dynamics, they have brains, they have sensory organs and everything. So what I try to do is boil it all down and simplify it into what I think are the core elements of what these animals are, what they're doing, and by distilling these elements, I think I get a clearer picture of how group decision making is good or bad. And so I think for a lot of us, uh, one of the first important theories in this realm is called Condorcet jury theorem. And so this is a
And actually,
simple.
can I interrupt you quickly just before we
Sure.
start talking about the old jury theorem? I think it
Yeah.
might be useful to kind of explain what you mean by like these simple rules creating these complicated and complex behaviors, right? So you use some examples of like of ant colonies or fish schooling, and I think. If I sort of summarize what I think you're saying, it's that, this looks like a pretty like wild, complicated thing that's actually going on. But in reality, if you have, say, a fish that just says, okay, I need to stay this far away from the other fish that are next to me, that they can almost have like one rule or maybe like two or three simple rules like that then result in something that's this, giant school of fish traveling. Is that accurate? And if so, can you maybe give us like an explanation of one of your results?
Yeah, definitely. So there's different layers when you're to think about when you're thinking about a collective making a decision. One of the fundamental layers is the network structure in which these animals or humans are communicating with each other. So if you think about humans, and an easy example is say like the structure of Twitter or the structure of Facebook. Like I follow some people on Twitter, they follow some people, they follow some people, and so that creates a network by which information flows through the system. Um, for animal groups, it can be quite different. So we often think of animals as communicating locally with each other. So as a bird or as a fish, I'm looking only at the few individuals that are right next to me, my near neighbors. And they're looking at their near neighbors. And so there's a very local connection of networks and that information can spread through. So it's still a network, but the network properties and structure is different for a school of fish where it's locally connected versus, say, Twitter, where I can follow somebody in Europe or I could follow somebody in Australia, and you get much more different network properties.
Yeah,
Um,
so you like can't skip nodes or whatever in the network. It has to be someone close to you. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. More or less, that's also a simplification, but more or less. Um, for ants, I deposit a little bit of pheromone onto the ant trail and I walk away. And whatever ants walk over where I was can smell that pheromone. And so that's a different kind of network as well. And so I think when we're thinking about these different kinds of species and thinking about decision making in these species, we have to think really carefully about what are the network structures that these species or groups live in, and how does that affect the decision making processes that come out of it.
Got it. And then so if we take ants, I know you've written some papers on ants, and I think people have probably seen some of this stuff too, even people who aren't, paying attention to the emergent properties of animal behavior. Someone's probably sent a link of like, check out this ant death spiral where you have, ants who somehow ended up in a weird pheromone trail where they just go in a circle in this giant swarm until they all die or whatever. So what's the situation with ants? What have you found with them?
Yeah, I mean, so there's tons of species of ants, and they're all super interesting. Um, and so I guess when you think of a canonical ant colony, you probably think of a little hill, little sand hill in your backyard, and these little ants like walking around, I don't know, carrying little bits of insects or whatever back to their nest. The ants that I've tended to study are army ants. So we study them in Panama, and they're very different to what we imagine as like backyard ants. So these are like massive colonies of up to a million ants in a colony, and they're quite big ants. Um, and so they go around just devastating the jungle around them, like eating all the ants, all the other prey around. And so since they're so destructive, they can't have an underground nest like we normally envision ants to have, because if they stay in one place, then there's like no more food to eat after like 3 or 4 days. And so what they do is they actually link up their legs together, like hundreds of thousands of them, and form this like beach ball sized nest made out of ant bodies that's connected to some like tree trunk. It's
It's so
insane.
cool. It's so
Yeah,
cool.
It is insane to see in real life. And so they're creating the same thing as that you see underground in your backyard, like these nests and these like corridors and these rooms where the queen lives and where the eggs live and where the food is stashed. But it's all just like connected bodies of ants, like creating these structures. It's absolutely crazy. Uh, and every 4 days, they like deconstruct this entire beach ball sized body of ants, march like 100 meters to some other destination, and reconstruct the structure overnight. Um, and so that's how they stay mobile and can move around and find enough prey to eat on a constant basis. And so what I've studied there is the ants linking up their bodies to make bridges. So they can make bridges on the trail to shorten the path when you're carrying prey back home. Um, and yeah, we've investigated what are the rules that these ants follow in order to join a bridge or to leave a bridge, and how does that bridge have like an ultimate effect on increasing the prey intake rate for the colony itself. It's totally wild system. I mean, it's one of those things where like you, as a biologist, you just like go there and just look at these ants. And you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this. It's like it seems like an ultimate case of collective behavior in some ways.
Yeah, totally. Why hasn't that been mined for more like science fiction or horror movies, right? I feel like insect behavior and weird stuff like that shows up, like the Borg or, Alien or something like that, where it's like, okay, you're sort of taking these bits and pieces of things that real insects do. And that seems like just a movie waiting to happen.
I think so too. I mean, like there are swarm horror movies, right? Or
Sure.
sci-fi movies. Yeah, I think this is an instance that's like waiting to happen.
Yeah.
So if you know of anyone looking for ideas,
Yeah.
I'm
Some
happy to talk to them.
Totally. But to kind of to dig into that, right? I mean that there's this crazy collective behavior happening that you mentioned. It's not even just, oh, we're going to create, this nest, which is pretty extreme to think about these insects doing that. But we're going to create this nest, it's going to be mobile, and then we're also going to like actually create bridges with our own bodies that enables our mobile nest to move around better or to get prey back to the mobile nest better. Is that accurate? It's more prey back to the nest.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. And so, if you think about humans doing that, it's like there's a foreman on the job that's like, all right, here's the plans for the bridge that we're going to make. There's someone with like a spreadsheet of, steel. How much steel do we need to order? Right. But this is clearly not happening for ants. So how the hell are they doing it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's still unknown about that particular ant system. And it gets even crazier because these ants are basically blind. So they're just like walking around, feeling each other, sensing pheromones. Um, and yeah, it's a huge mystery as to how these little interactions. I mean, I guess this is what we are talking about earlier with the like individual interactions causing an emergence of collective phenomena, including decision making. But this is sort of like maybe one of the most extreme examples of that, where it's like a blind ants just bumbling around. It's like, oh, I felt this, so maybe I'll like join. You don't even know that you're joining a bridge. You're like, I'm just gonna like link up my legs here, um, and that's what each individual ant is doing all day, every day. But then if you zoom out, you get this suddenly like emergence of bridges that are functional and like create shortcuts in the foraging trail. You get this emergence of these beach ball sized nests with corridors and tunnels and things like that. And yeah, as you're saying, that's a great point that there's no overseer. Like we say that there's a queen, but the queen has very little, if any, decision making power. And so it's totally emergent, these like complex functional structures out of very, very sensor out of insects that have like very, very little sensory or decision making abilities. And so that mapping and that scaling from like individual level, very poor abilities to like this grand scale of really, really impressive and remarkable abilities is, I think, is at the crux of the problem. Or, I mean, it's like so, fascinating to study. But we can think about that with humans as well. Like we go about our lives, we're like on Twitter, on Facebook, digesting things, liking things, sharing things. And then on the scale that maybe we don't perceive, there's like this mass level like flow of information changing the course of elections, causing the spread of false rumors or whatever. And all we're doing is just liking, sharing, like these little microscopic things. And so I think the mapping between that microscopic and these grand scale societal impacts is massively important to study and understand.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy, right? That we're just kind of like, oh yeah, I have a few minutes to kill while I'm waiting in line. I'm gonna bust out Facebook and like here's some stuff to look at, and you're just sort of scratching this like mild impulse itch that you have, and yeah, in reality, you're creating this like n-dimensional vector space of everyone's preferences and behaviors that is like self-optimizing to manipulate future users. So it's like, yeah, we're not just creating a beach ball of a hive. We're creating, an n-dimensional beach ball of human behavior and preferences. Cool.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's different with humans is that there is the ability to sort of like poke and prod these massive systems for better or for worse, right? Like you can have some bad agents that has like figured out these rules of the system. And like if you just insert bots here and here and here, you can cause like massive change and massive spread of information, or vice versa. And so that's something that's different from the ants, where ants, there is no overseer, they're just doing their thing. But with humans, we can think about like organizations, governments, or just bad actors in general, and how can you manipulate these kinds of systems, and how can we design systems that are robust to these kinds of manipulations.
Yeah, totally. So we were talking about like ants, and we can see similar behavior, fish schooling, birds in flight, et cetera. And actually, John Conway's Game of Life is something that probably a lot of people have seen, but maybe aren't super familiar with the name. So I'll link it in the show notes. But it's some very simple rules, just with like little like basically pixels moving around on a screen, and every time you run it, you just get like more and more like different emergent behavior like that, where it looks like it's creating like flocks of birds or something, and it's just these tiny pixel rules result in really crazy stuff happening. So, we have these emergent behaviors and this way of just sort of like reacting to stuff around us and potentially creating larger structures. And something that you studied in addition to just the animal behavior like that is also, people sort of taking in information, or not people, but agents taking in information and making decisions based upon that, and what accuracy looks like in there, and, different types of scenarios where it's better to have more actors, fewer actors, small groups of actors. So, what you started to talk about the jury theorem before I interrupted you to talk about ants, but yeah, what's going on with that?
Yeah, so the most basic conception is what's called the Condorcet jury theorem. So it came out in like the 1780s or something. Um, and it was a demonstration that democracies can be good. And so he imagined a jury deciding whether somebody is guilty or not. And if every person in the jury has some above chance, so above 50% chance probability of guessing correctly, um, and you combine your votes through majority rule, then the larger the jury, the more like the higher the probability that you'll collectively make the correct decision. And so people have sort of like glommed onto that and been like, oh, see, groups can improve decision making ability. But there's some really strong assumptions baked into that theorem. So it assumes that everybody's getting information independently, and making decisions independently. You're voting through majority rule, these sorts of things. Everybody has an above chance probability of making the right decision. And if you look at, nature or human decision making, the assumptions of this model like basically never pan out. For the independence rule, which is something I've thought a lot about personally, so we watch a lot of the same TV shows or like read the same newspapers. Like a lot of us read, there's a set of major newspapers, and a lot of us get our news from that. And so even if we think we're all doing our independent research, we're all just reading the same articles by and large. And so there's actually a strong correlation in the kind of information and opinions that we have as opposed to independence. And so in particular, in my own work, I've thought about like, how does that independence or correlation matter in terms of collective decision making? And what I found is that in a lot of cases, if you have correlated information, which again, as I argue, is super common in humans where we're reading the same news sources, or even in animals where they're hearing and seeing like similar things, you actually don't get this monotonic increase in accuracy as group size increases. So in fact, what I found was that oftentimes like smaller or medium-sized groups perform the best. Um, and smaller groups like below that optimum um, don't do as well. And like the hand wavy explanation for that is that they're not really like taking advantage of the wisdom of crowds as much as they could. But if you're too large, if you're like beyond that optimal in the other direction, um, you kind of get trapped in a sense, and you're like relying completely on that correlated information, and you're not drawing on the diversity of information that's available. And so again, that's bad. So everybody just blindly follows, or the group basically blindly follows, say, the New York Times or something, even though only a subset of us read the New York Times. So there's some like amplification of correlated information in these large groups.
So let me ask some questions about that, and maybe we can use like the classic jelly bean estimation situation as like a way to maybe make this more tangible. So like a classic wisdom of crowds type of problem is, say you have a big bowl full of jelly beans and you ask 100 people to estimate how many jelly beans are in the bowl, and you're going to get a wide variety of answers. And if you take the average of those answers, you're usually going to get something that's like shockingly close to the amount of jelly beans. Is that like a reasonable framing of like a positive wisdom of crowds type of situation?
Yeah, sure.
So what you're saying though is that, okay, we can't assume that people's in a lot of real life situations, we can't assume that people's information is uncorrelated. So there might be like another layer going on that's like, oh, there's all these pamphlets around about best jelly bean estimation strategy. Right. And it's like some people read this pamphlet about jelly bean estimation and some people read this pamphlet about jelly bean estimation. So you're going to have these groups that are kind of like using a similar strategy. Is that what you mean by correlation?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like, okay, you're trying to estimate these jelly beans. Maybe we like Google, how do you estimate jelly beans? And Google tells you like the top 5 hits, and we're all reading the same pages. Like, oh, you could calculate the volume of each jelly bean, then like multiply it, divide it by the volume of the jar or something. It's like, okay, cool, we'll do that. And that gives you a sort of okay estimate, but there's errors baked into that way of estimating. And if we all read that pamphlet, then we all have the same error, and it kind of propagates. Um,
Yeah.
Another way you can get correlation is just by talking to each other. So like, oh, I thought it was like 300. What do you think? And you're like, I think it's 700. I'm like, what? And so we talk about it, and then we share information. We're like, oh, maybe it's like 600. And then we go somewhere else and like talk to someone else. And so again, like maybe we started off with independent estimates, but then by talking and sharing information, maybe there's differences in confidence as well. Like maybe I stand up and I'm like, hey guys, I majored in physics. I know how to do this. The answer is 400. And that'll have an outsized effect on everyone's estimates because they're like, oh, this person seems like an expert. Like, let's just copy them. Um, and so that can introduce correlations as well. So correlations can pop up from like many different mechanisms.
Got it. So it's potentially, outside information that can result in correlations or like social learning between people. And that, in the
Mm-hmm.
case of jelly bean estimation, that is something where the wisdom of crowds tends to hold. And if we were imagining the situation where we're Googling how to estimate jelly beans, like the results are probably actually going to be helpful and would
Mm-hmm.
probably make most people better. So in relationship to the jury theorem, then it's like, oh, well, this is a place where that holds because that's going to improve people's likelihood of being accurate. Well, it's not really binary, but like
Mm-hmm.
I think you understand what I'm saying, right? That it's like that's going to improve people's results. But if we have situations where the correlated information is not necessarily going to be something that improves it, then actually that makes things worse. Is that a good way of framing it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think you're right. Like if we all rely on the same correlated information, so some major news source or some Wikipedia article, that's probably a pretty good source of information, right? Like it wouldn't be a major source if it wasn't pretty good. Maybe that's an assumption that's not correct, but by and large, maybe. Um, But the problem here is that when that major source of information is wrong, then all of us are wrong. And I think one of the key benefits of collective decision making is this idea of like cancellation of errors. Is that maybe sometimes you're wrong, sometimes I'm wrong, sometimes the third person's wrong, but the odds of us all being wrong together, if we are using independent information, is pretty low. And so on average, our group information remains quite good, and we're sort of like robust to little fluctuations in bad information. But if we're all following the same information, even if it's pretty good, when that good information is wrong, then we're all wrong, and it's sort of catastrophic. And so, yeah, the idea is like, how do you use that good major source of information, but still retain that robustness to bad information?
Got it. So what you found then is that in situations that are complex, that these smaller groups actually result in better collective decision making because, like you said, they're robust to potentially incorrect correlated information, kind of like sweeping through the system and making everyone wrong at the same time.
Yeah, it kind of strikes that optimal balance. It still incorporates that good information, but when the information's bad, it still allows for enough uh, noise in a way that still preserves this other element of the wisdom of crowds, where like cancellation of errors. So there's sort of like two sources of information, and how do you balance those two? And what I found is that, yeah, these medium-sized groups can balance that optimally.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the Condorcet jury theorem, where one of the assumptions is that each individual is going to have a 50% or greater than 50% chance of being correct, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of your work sort of shows that depending on how you relax, maybe that assumption or some of the other assumptions about like how information is correlated, that you get sort of spaces where like these smaller groups are good. You get some spaces where just being totally on your own is good, and you get some spaces where being like an infinite number of people or agents all contributing is good. So what do those different spaces look like, and how do you change the assumptions to get them?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to like dive too deep into the model. It's like hard to explain in some ways over audio.
Sure.
uh, but it's basically just the probabilities of these different information sources being right or wrong. Um, so if like the correlated source is super good, then it's like better to be in a certain group size. If the correlated information source is very bad, then you want to be in this other group size. And so it just depends on these relative values of how good or how bad are these correlated or uncorrelated news sites, or whatever you want to call it.
Got it. And essentially like typically in a complex system, that you're going to find that these small groups tend to strike that balance, like you said, between, information loss. So basically not getting swept up in whatever something incorrect is, as well as like being able to, learn socially from each other or use good information that gets passed along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in other work I've done, I've kind of like taken that a step further, where so in the earlier work, I just imagined just a homogeneous group, and you kind of like decide via majority rule, sort of like how Condorcet imagined it. But then I was thinking about, real networks, like we were talking about a while ago, um, where animal groups have certain network structures, Twitter and Facebook have other certain network structures, and I was imagining like what are some network features that are maybe ubiquitous across these systems, um, and clusters within networks seem quite common. So in say like a school of fish, the fish aren't just like randomly moving in and out of each other. There's sort of like stable subgroups that form, either like because they're related to each other or have similar experiences or whatever. So these stable subgroups form and then persist within the group structure. And obviously the same as with Twitter, there's like clusters, whether based on like political opinions or geography or, interest or whatever. Um, you also get these clusters that form. And so I was wondering what effects that those clusters have on the kind of decision making that we're just talking about, in these worlds with like correlated information. Um, and what I find is that these clusters always cause information loss. So as like decisions propagate from these subclusters outwards to the broader group, information is lost about what information is lost. Sorry, how do I frame this? So the sum total of information that each individual has isn't really represented in the collective decision. So in the process of like sharing information, some fraction of individuals, if information and opinions like kind of disappear and no longer are represented in the collective decision. And so, yeah, you might imagine like, oh, that's bad. Like if information is good for decision making, which is, I think, an assumption that all of us have, then losing information must be bad and leads to better or to worse decisions. But in fact, I find that it's like not necessarily true. Like information loss can be good sometimes. And that's exactly for the same reason that I found an optimal group size in the earlier work, where if your group is too big, you kind of do poorly. In this sense, if you have clusters within your network structure and information loss, then your group effectively behaves as if it's a smaller group because you've lost the voices of some fraction of your group. So you're essentially behaving like a smaller group. And in those scenarios where being in a smaller group is better for decision making, then information loss is better. I don't know if I explained that well, but you
No,
can
totally.
clarify if you'd like to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that sort of what you're getting at is just this idea of having more information passing from each person to another or each agent to another is not necessarily always good, right? That we talked about a few different ways in which that can go awry. And that, in these cases that we're talking about, we actually want to, well, not necessarily we, but like it's a better strategy for there to be these kind of like little segments that potentially, aggregate all of the decision making in that segment and pass it on, and that actually results in overall better outcomes.
Yeah. I guess to zoom out massively, the general point is that some of these details about how networks are structured, how information is passed from individual to individual, what kind of information we perceive either locally from our group or from external sources like news media, it all matters in major ways to what the collective decision-making outcome is. And so you can completely turn predictions on its head, where at first we thought like bigger groups are better. And now it's like, well, not necessarily. Maybe smaller groups are better, or maybe medium groups are better. We used to think, more information is better. Now it's like, well, maybe that's not the case. Like maybe like information loss can be good in some ways. And so really, I think it complicates the picture a lot. It'd be nice to have some simple recipe of like Condorcet jury theorem, bigger is better. But in real life, like all these little details matter a lot. And so when we're studying real life networks like animal groups or Twitter or Facebook, we're learning that more and more of these features, like which features matter and which features don't matter. And by understanding which features matter, then we can start to, understand why do we get the overall sort of like spread of information that we do, how can we control it, and how can we promote the spread of, true information rather than false information. So that's sort of like the general take home is that like, yeah, we're learning about all these like nuanced details that start to matter.
Totally. And as you were talking, I was just thinking of a different version of potential information loss being positive for decision making, which is, I believe there's some results showing that if you give experts too much information about something, that they'll actually make worse decisions than if they only have like a few key facts, where it seems like they start to like overfit their decision making to like all the data that they get, and they think that it matters more than it does. So I don't remember too much about this, but we can just say, let's say like horse racing or something, right? And I think that might even be what this was studying. And it's like, okay, you have someone who's trying to predict, which horse is going to win, and then you give them like some very basic information, maybe just like, okay, here's some, time trials from these horses, and they're like, okay, cool, like this one is probably probably going to win. And that's more accurate than if you give them like the time trials and like what the horses have been eating and the jockeys and all this other stuff where they start to like actually update their prediction too much based upon the new information, whereas just the kind of like rough squint and like take a look at the most salient feature actually gives them better results. Is that potentially related, or do you think that's a totally separate thing?
I mean, that sounds like information overload, right? Like our brains have some like inherent limit onto how much information we can process. And if there's too much information, we can get super stressed out. We can start making bad decisions. And it's also about like weighing these pieces of information correctly, right? If you give me just like the most important salient information, that's like cool. I'm going to use that to make my decision making. If you give me like 1,000 pieces of information, like here's the hoof size of the horse, here's like the eye size or whatever, and I like start weighing these pieces of information, then like the weighings could be like really different, and I just get some crazy result at the end, because I don't know, I can't differentiate what's important and what's not. Um, I think it's important. It's sort of like a different idea, but it's certainly important in the kinds of things that we're thinking about. Like surely humans are facing information overload now because of social media. And I think that's a separate layer. So we've been talking a lot about how network structure affects decisions collectively. And then another layer is sort of the individual rules that we follow, when we're embedded in these networks. So we were talking earlier about these army ants. They're blind, they're feeling each other, making these sort of like individual decisions based on local information. And similarly, humans do that as well, except that's like less local these days. Um, and so I think it ties in there. How does information overload change the way we process information or discover information? Or, like we're seeing just thousands and thousands of tweets every day. How does it affect, everything about how we behave within these networks?
Yeah, totally. So if we sort of jump from these models of, okay, here's a correlation coefficient, and
Yeah.
here's is this going to be accurate or not, to some of these more real life types of scenarios that you're discussing. I mean, you mentioned before we started recording that you're taking a look at, along with some other SFI folks, what is potentially going on with the hyper-connected networks that humans are part of now, right? I mean, you use social media as an example, and it's not even just social media. It's like, okay, you can email anyone, you can Slack this many people in your workspace. You can, well, not right now, but before, you could travel pretty much anywhere you wanted to. That as we connect networks more and more, we're potentially exposing ourselves to some of these issues. So what are you guys finding there?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're just thinking broadly about it. There's no real results as yet, and it's not just SFI people. It's this network of people, sort of all over the world, I guess, which is kind of like to the point you were talking about. Uh, we're just thinking broadly about, how can we link what we're studying? Like I'm studying these really simple distilled models. Um, Sometimes I do experiments on say army ants or fish. Can we say something about what's really going on in the world? Like one could argue that it doesn't matter. Like studying army ants is of little consequence. Like you're not changing the world by studying army ants. But I think what, is clear to us and to everybody who uses the internet is that there are things that matter, in the world, that are collective behaviors. So social media, how we are connected to each other, how we like consume information, these things clearly affect how we feel about things like the pandemic, how we feel about vaccines, how we feel about GMOs, how we feel about different political parties. And that can have real impacts on people's lives. It can be a life and death matter for some people. Um, and so what we're thinking about is like, how can we translate what we are working on and say something useful about these broader, more important social structures, um, and hopefully change them for the better. And so what we've been arguing is that we should turn our field, so say this broader field of collective behavior, into what's called a crisis discipline. And so this term's been used, I think, since the 80s to talk about conservation science, so like conserving, say, like rainforests or endangered species, and also climate science. And sort of like a new, like a different way of thinking about scientific research, uh, where it's now the question is like, how can we do research in a way that more quickly allows us to say something useful or make recommendations about how do we structure our social media platforms, say. Um, and I think as scientists, we're like highly uncomfortable with making these sorts of recommendations. Like we like to make, incremental progress. We like to figure things out. And it's like, oh, we know this is true. Let's move on to the next question. It's like, okay, we know this is true. And it's so if you ask somebody like, how do you fix Twitter? It's like, oh my God, like I can make some hypotheses, but I don't want to like actually, I mean, me personally, I'm speaking for myself now. I would feel so uncomfortable with actually changing the algorithm of Twitter and possibly affecting people's lives dramatically. And so there's a disconnect between scientists wanting like solid truth and political recommend or like policy recommendations that are, have an element of like fuzziness and uncertainty about them. Um, but I think we need to have that responsibility to step up because it's already making such a big difference in our lives. And if we stand back and do nothing about it, then that's the action that you choose to take, right? You choose to do nothing and that has some impact. Or we could choose to do something like we know something about collective behavior, we know something about collective decision making. And so how can we transform what we've learned or we're going to learn in the next, say, 5 years, um, in order to say something about how we can improve our own lives on these platforms?
So as you're talking about that, something that comes to mind is, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about is related to accuracy in collective decision making, right? Like, are you
Yeah.
getting the right answer? And there's either a binary like yes or no, or it's like the jelly beans where it's, okay, you're either closer or further away from this actual number that we know. And actually, Joshua Becker, previous podcast guest, did show that even in like highly polarized political situations that social learning occurs and people converge on accurate answers, maybe with some slight adjustments for like the partisan nature of it, but they do get better over time. But sort of what you're talking about in these real life scenarios, people aren't optimizing for accuracy or correctness, right? That like people on Twitter aren't trying to get the actual facts correct about something. They're not trying to estimate the number of jelly beans, right? That they're optimizing in this totally different fitness landscape of like social status and like whether it feels good to say something or reacting to something bad that happens to them. And they actually seem to be almost decoupled from accuracy, right? That seems to like not even that if it is a part of their fitness function, like it's diminishingly small. So, I mean, how does that potentially relate if we're talking about these ideas of like wisdom of crowds where, accuracy isn't really part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few ideas like bundled up in what you just said. So yeah, so in a lot of topics, it's hard to define accuracy or impossible to define accuracy, right? Like a lot of things are like values. It's like, do you value this or do you value that? And I mean, if you're partisan, you're like, well, this is the right answer and that's the wrong answer. But I think like in the global, universe of things, there's no like intrinsic right answer for a lot of these topics that are being debated. Um, and so I think it's tricky because as scientists, you don't want to promote a certain set of values that would be as unethical as anything else that we've seen on social media. Um, I think one thing we could promote is truth, though, that like false information is bad and true information is good. And so at least like whatever your value system is, whatever your like political beliefs, our decision making should be grounded on information that's true. Like I feel like everyone should be able to agree on that. Um, and so yeah, I think it is tricky because like what I think of with say animal groups, it tends to be fairly simple. Like avoiding a predator is good, getting eaten by a predator is bad, food is good, no food is bad, and things get much messier in the human realm um, where there's no not necessarily like a right or wrong answer for a lot of cases. To your other point about how people aren't necessarily seeking accuracy when they're just browsing Instagram or whatever. I would probably say that maybe it's instructive to think about these army ants again, where the army ants aren't trying to build a bridge. They're not trying to build a nest. They're just like following some rules that are maybe akin to just like scrolling Instagram, pushing these buttons. And then on an emergent level, something constructive and adaptive happens. And so it might be instructive to think of it in that way, where like in our daily lives, we're not like necessarily trying to seek out information. We're just trying to like feel good, but on an emergent level that has some impact on um, opinion change, say over the course of months or years, or people who are like on the fence, it might change how they form opinions in the future. So I think just because like individuals are not aware of these larger scale emergent behaviors doesn't mean they're not contributing to them.
Yeah, totally. That the individual thing someone is optimizing for, like you said before, isn't necessarily related to how much true or false information is flowing through the network,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like you said, the ant is optimizing for like, all right, this pheromone makes me feel like I really need another ant's leg in my leg.
Yeah.
And they're not aware of the bridge, right? And an individual can doesn't need to think about, okay, what's the rate of spread of rumors in this entire social network, that they just need to think about like, oh, this feels good to look at or click on.
Yeah, and I think yeah, it kind of like brings up this idea of like what are we trying to optimize? So right now, a lot of these corporations that run these social media platforms are trying to optimize profits, right? I mean, they have to be. Um, so presumably they're like tweaking their algorithms such that it's generating more attention on their platforms and therefore generating more ad revenue. Um, and the question is like, is that what we want guiding our social interactions societally or globally? Probably answer is no, right? So like, and then so then what do we optimize? Like, do we want to optimize like people's like happiness, like feel goodness? It's like maybe not. Or is there some like broader thing about like, moving in some direction societally that we want to um, push towards, like sharing true information as opposed to false information? And if so, so there's different ways, like incentives, right? Like profit maximization, like individual happiness or whatever, or truth. And so, given those incentives, we might reach very different conclusions about the kinds of network structures we want to create or the kinds of algorithms showing what information is fed to whom they want to create. So for like as a concrete example, I think it's been shown that people feel better when they see information that agrees with their own beliefs. So we get these like echo chambers forming. But so that might be good if we're trying to optimize happiness like individually. But it might be better for collective decision making if we are experiencing opinions that are different from our own. So someone from the opposite end of the political spectrum. And that might make us feel angry or uncomfortable or whatever. But there might be some net benefit effect of like getting better information or more diverse information, and forming more accurate opinions individually and maybe forming better opinions societally. So I think these like incentive structures need to be like written down explicitly, and then we can form what are the best network structures or like behaviors um, in order to maximize that goal societally.
Yeah, totally. And the group that you're working with on this, have you all decided that true information is sort of like the thing that you want to optimize for?
Um, no, I mean it's just posing these questions, I think, and I think we need to like talk about it as a society or with government um, officials. Like I don't think it's up to us as this like small group of scientists to decide, what's good for society. But I think it's sort of like highlighting that we need to like decide on it because right now profit maximization is what's driving a lot of the information flow and spread of opinions of different kinds. And I think most of us would agree that that's not what we want to maximize. And so what the right answer is sort of for us to decide on. But I'm pretty sure it's not going to be Twitter's profit margin
Yeah.
or whatever. So yeah, yeah. So again, it's like scientists dipping their toes into these societal matters, and so I don't think it's up for us to say what should be maximized.
Totally. And you mentioned that scientists tend to be a little uncomfortable being like, okay, I have this toy problem that shows this result. Here's what you should do in real life. But that there's this sort of whatever mounting pressure to maybe step out and be like, I have this toy problem, but here's what you should actually do in real life. So what recommendations have come up? What have you guys thought of that's like, okay, this is something that we should really potentially put out there for these networks?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we've already mentioned, that sort of like the correlation of news sources matters. The size of groups or clusters matters. Um, the specific like opinion dynamics matters as well. Like what kind of rules are we sharing with each other? Um, I mean, that's sort of like some of the lessons from like my own personal work. And there's other people who are doing amazing work by gathering huge data sets from Twitter, like scraping Twitter or scraping Reddit or whatever, and sort of like empirically learning the rules of behavior on these massive systems. But again, a lot of these data sets are like proprietary and like controlled by the organization, like the companies themselves. And so oftentimes it's hard to study them in detail as like outside academics. Um, and so yeah, maybe it's a sort of like call to arms that a lot of these sort of separate subgroups of academics should get together and talk about how to combine different approaches from these simple toy models to complex data sets. How do we combine all of that information that we learned in the past 10 years or so into some formal recommendations? And I think you've talked to some of these people already, like Joshua Becker is in this computational social science world where I think they focus a lot more on these like big data sets and kind of like gleaning these rules of behaviors from this like huge trove of data. And I'm sort of like in a different part of that realm of like, let's start small, let's start simple and add a few ingredients at a time and see what comes up. And already it's like, whoa, these are like very different behaviors than what I would have suspected. So I think they're both like very useful approaches, and there's some maybe like convergence between in the middle that we can where we can start getting to making like really productive recommendations.
Yeah, totally. And to sort of jump to something topical based upon that, I mean, we see similar stuff with COVID-19, right? That there's a lot of information out there, and we need people both like crunching the numbers on like the actual spread of stuff and be like, okay, well, we thought this is what was going to happen in New York and here's what actually happened. And then we also need people simultaneously, trying to come up with a theoretical model of like how diseases spread through networks. And like, if you take enough of those things, hopefully you get somewhere useful, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to kind of circle back on some of the recommendations, right? I mean, you have these ideas about modularity in networks. Do you think that that's something that social media companies should consider, as like forcing more modularity into what's going on, right? Reducing the speed of spread of information or making it more difficult for information to spread beyond like certain, little clusters within the network. Is that something that you would see as like a net positive?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, modularity and clustering in networks already exists to a high degree in these social networks. It's just an outcome of people's preferences and behaviors. So if I'm into soccer, I want to hang out with other soccer fans, and so that forms like a little community. But then also some of us are like also into science, and so there's some like what we were talking about before, like a Venn diagram between that, and so you get these clusters of clusters, and these communities that are interconnected to each other. So in some sense, they exist already, and I don't know if like forcing more of that would be better or worse. Um, um, and yeah, I don't know. It's it does make me uncomfortable to think about, okay, I have this very simple result. Now look at Twitter and how do you make it better? I think at the very least, at the moment, we can write down a series of attributes that we know are important, right? So like clustering, um, like this network structure. So are there like nodes with tons of connections to it? Sort of these like celebrities on these platforms. And so obviously they'll have more influence and more power. And like quantifying that, like how much power do they have? If we like manipulate them in some way, how does that affect everything else? So we can write down attributes that we think are important based on our models and our data. Um, and then we can go into these specific systems, say like Twitter, Facebook, or whatever, and actually look at these attributes, because there's a million attributes we could look at. Like these networks are so complex. You could focus on any number of things, and so at least like distilling it down to like, oh, here's like the 5 attributes that we think are like most important about network structure. It at least like focus their efforts a lot.
Yeah, totally. Because I mean, I think that, before you were saying, oh, these companies are pushing to maximize profits, and I think there is some element of that. But I also think that, a lot of the actual executives of these companies like legitimately believe in the mission that they have. In Facebook's case of like, okay, does Mark Zuckerberg believe that the more connection between people there is, the better the outcome is, pretty much no matter what? Like, I would say yes. He probably like literally fully believes that. Right. And that he would probably trade more connection between people for profit. Right. If it's like, oh, I could make more money by doing this, but that's going to reduce the ability of people to connect. I think he would actually select, I would rather people connect. Right. But I think that, based upon some of your results and stuff that we've seen, it's like, oh, is actually connecting people always good? And that, these recommendations that you potentially have for how to structure networks might be something that is actually really relevant, where it's like, hey, you want to connect people, but like only to a point, because there's these potential negative outcomes.
Yeah, and yeah, I think there's like nuances there to think about as well. Like we see the appearance of these echo chambers, and they're getting stronger and stronger every year. We're polarizing ourselves. We don't want to hear opinions that are contrary to our own, and so we kind of like are stuck in these bubbles. That is a form of clustering and modularity, but I think a lot of us would argue that's bad. They were kind of like stuck in this like stalemate, and not really able to communicate across the aisle and come to some like consensus or compromise. On the other hand, I think if we're all uber connected, that's probably not great either from a theoretical standpoint. Like I think you need these subclusters in order to generate diversity of opinion and innovations. And if you just are all connected, you kind of, that's all washed out, and maybe you're just like all listening to like the most influential person. So if you think of like, I don't know, like languages over the past few centuries, like before, global travel, we had tens of thousands of languages across the world, and now we have a small number, like Spanish, English, Mandarin, Hindi, and so we get like much less diversity now that we're super connected, and you're not going to have like new languages appear de novo, because it's going to get immediately washed out by, say, English. So in some sense, you want these little pockets, weird pockets of like communities to generate ideas. Some are bad, some are good, to drive innovation. And so I think there's good and bad in clustering communities. And I think we just need to like take a deeper look, like how, again, it's like with crowds, sometimes you can get wisdom of crowds, sometimes you get madness of crowds. With clustering, you can get diversity, but you can also get echo chambers. So how do you balance these two out in an optimal way? How do you promote the good stuff and not the bad stuff?
Yeah, and the first thing that pops into my head with what you're talking about too with languages is like music scenes as well.
Yeah.
Right, that's like another example where you end up with these, if you look at hip hop in the United States in the early 90s, right? It's like each city had its own distinct sound that was very much like, oh, this is what it sounds like in Memphis. This is what hip hop sounds like in like each borough of New York, right? And it's like all related, but all different. And that I don't know that necessarily exists anymore, right? That's kind of not, that seems to have sort of like washed away. And maybe there's other types of music where that is going on. So that's an example of like, okay, maybe if we connect things too much, we stifle some creativity by making things too related. But to your point about
Yeah.
like echo
Well,
chambers too. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to make the opposite point of that, where I feel like, and I'm no music expert, but I feel like back in the day, music was dominated by like radio stations and sort of had like more homogeneity of like what was super popular. But now with the internet and like Spotify and like all like Bandcamp and things like that, you can have these like little pockets of communities. And like from my experience, it seems like in some ways there's a richer set of musical tastes and subgenres arising because of you can form these like communities on the internet that you couldn't in the past. So I don't know. I think there's like different ways to look at it.
Yeah, totally. And to your point earlier, there's probably like optimal levels of different things to get stuff, right? Where it's like, okay, to generate a certain amount of creativity within certain types of music scenes, there's probably an optimal amount of information being shared between different scenes, right? But for the listener to be able to find what they want, maybe there's a different optimal amount of like access to stuff that they can find, like through Spotify or radio stations or whatever, right? That would be my first impulse is like, okay, that maybe what's best for the listener isn't actually best for the creators.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we keep coming back to this like optimal level of like information sharing, and more is not necessarily better. Because I think in music, if there's some like super good innovation, you want that to spread. Say like the electric guitar. Uh, if it's like super useful, it can like lead to a lot more creativity. You want that to spread, but you don't want so much to spread that you lose the sort of like local flavor, like you were talking about. So yeah, there's some, more is not necessarily better.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, just sort of speculating wildly about this, right? I mean, if you just think about the music scene, I think that people optimizing to perform well with their peers locally probably results in better outcomes than people trying to like join the worldwide network, right? That if you
Mhm.
think about a lot of music that is super creative or comes up with some type of incredible innovation, new genres, etc., it's like, oh, there's this group of these 5 to 10 freak people who all ended up together and just kind of like pushed each other further and further and further. And then when they kind of went out into the broader scene, it's like those guys just like totally invented this new style of jazz, or like it's the Wu-Tang Clan. Like what the hell are they even doing? You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
that to me seems like a maybe a good example of like, oh, this small group then comes up with something that when introduced to the larger group does very well.
totally. And you can also think of like uh, these sort of like time periods of like, okay, we're gonna go back home and like cloister and like innovate, and then once in a while we'll come out and like compare notes with each other. So like in science, we have these scientific conferences where we get together and like talk about ideas and like share results, and then we go back to our home institutions and like do our weird stuff for the rest of the year. And so that could be another strategy. I mean, I don't know how this maps to like social media or whatever, but like just thinking broadly about how do you get collections of people to innovate and produce good things, like that could be another strategy, like separating in time, whether you're together or alone.
Yeah, right. It's like the incentive to kind of like show up with something really good to a group of people who you also know are going to show up with something really good, and maybe you have some people close to you who you're like in a more day-to-day idea sharing and competition with, as opposed to just like jumping into the fire hose of information and content like on the internet all the time. That could be another like optimization problem to solve for creativity and innovation.
Yeah, I've thought about this also in terms of like open office plans, where, like 10 or 15 years ago, that became like all the rage. Like, oh, people are just talking a lot all the time and like sharing information. That's going to be great for creativity. But I think what people have found is that it can be like really distracting, and, you can't really like dive deep into your own thoughts. And so I think there's also a mixture of, these open office plans, but also you need a space, like a private space to like do your deep thinking and think of weird ideas. So it could also be applied there. Like, how do you maximize productivity in some sort of like creative workspace?
Has anyone done any research on? I mean, we're talking about these like different groups, sort of forming maybe echo chambers that we talked about on social media, like different music scenes, different research groups. And it seems like there's this component of rivalry which can turn really, really bad and like result in very negative dynamics, or there's a component of rivalry that can be positive where it's like, oh, you know what, the quality of play in most sports now is so much higher than it would have been whatever 50 years ago because rivalry has pushed people to actually like improve. So has anyone done any work on like how rivalries between different groups potentially create positive or negative outcomes?
I mean, that's a really good idea. I don't know. There's probably a lot of work, in like the social sciences that I'm not aware of. So just because I'm not aware doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm sure it exists. Like in the biological realm, I would say, evolution and competition is that is that rivalry in a sense. So like groups competing against each other for resources. Um, and so you're driving innovations. So given like limited cognitive constraints, like these like fairly simple army ants, these fairly simple fish, how do you evolve new ways of communicating or sharing information that gets you better collective behaviors? So that's driven by competition um, between individuals and between groups. But yeah, I think it's possibly much more interesting um, in the human realm, and I don't know of research in that direction, but I would love to learn more about it.
Yeah, because it's like, yeah, we look at competition depending on your bias, right? I mean, again, there's like a colloquialism for everything. There's you think of economic competition and people on the right are like, yeah, it's the fuel of growth, and people on the left are like, that results in folks up top exploiting everyone and the world falling apart. And like, there's truth to both sides of that. And so there's probably another optimization to be found of like, okay, how does competition result in positive outcomes as opposed to negative outcomes?
Yeah, totally.
Is there a
Yeah.
Condorcet competition theorem?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe there's space for new theorems in that way. Yeah. But yeah, I like how this like conversation has like ended up. Like there's beyond, so I mean these important things like social media or what I find important with animal groups. Beyond that, I think there's so many different areas that if you think about these things of like groups interacting, innovating, there's so many aspects where that relates to.
Yeah, totally. And to, sort of sum up some of the stuff that we've been talking about, right? I mean, it's like you have these examples in a lot of areas. I mean, from your research on animal behavior, and then sort of saying, okay, if we have different conditions, we're actually going to find different spots that are optimal in terms of like how much information is being shared, how many members are there in a group, et cetera. And that since a lot of the problems that we have currently are resulting from like massive collective action problems, right? That we probably do need to have people who are like, all right, we need to insert science on how this works to potentially solve these collective action problems rather than just like, oh, this is hard, everyone defects in the prisoner's dilemma and we all fall apart.
Yeah, I think it's like critical to be optimistic. Like it seems intractably complicated sometimes. Like even like a school of fish, we've been studying it for decades and learning some stuff, but still like extremely hard to figure out what a group of 50 fish are doing. And if you now zoom out to like billions of humans, you could be like, well, it's impossible to figure out. But I think yeah, optimism is pretty crucial. Like have hope that with enough data, ingenuity, the right modeling techniques, we can start to piece together what's happening, um, and get some understanding. It's crazy though. Like there's so much going on that's affecting our society that we have like very little intuition about or knowledge about. And I think it would probably improve society a lot if we could start to work towards that direction.
Albert, always good to end on a positive note, I think. So we
Yeah.
can wrap up there. I'll link to some of the papers that we talked about and your website. But is there anything in particular, any of the papers that you've done, or any work that you like to point folks towards if they want to learn more?
Um, uh, Not really. I mean, they're all kind of, I think they're all my babies. and I like them all. I know I want to say that on my website, if you go to like the publications page, there are links to PDFs for all of them. So some of them, if you go to the journal website, they're under paywalls. And so if you find yourself in that case, then you can either email me or go to my website to find PDFs.
Beautiful. And what's the website link?
It's thecowlab.com. So TheKaolab.com.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all of the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.